Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the GSMA's AI for Impact second webinar series edition in the series focusing on using mobile big data analytics to combat global challenges, including COVID-19. Welcome, everyone, to the second installment of the GSMA webinar series using mobile big data analytics to combat challenges, including COVID-19. My name is Rob Childs, the Strategic Engagement Lead for the GSMA's AI for Impact initiative, and I'll be hosting today's session for you. This edition will primarily focus on the policy and privacy considerations that are relevant when seeking to develop or adopt new services enabled by mobile big data analytics. This series was conceived as a means to support and share knowledge with supply-side stakeholders, so mobile network operators, but also demand-side stakeholders, so governments and policymakers, not only to showcase the great work already done in this area, but also to help those that are new to develop a foundation level of understanding should you be interested to establish provision or use of such services in your location. The first session, and a recording of which you can access on the GSMA Better Future webpage, provided a high-level introduction to the area of mobile big data analytics. And if this is a new topic area for you and the first time you're joining us, I would encourage you to seek that out and to watch it, as it provides a broad introduction to the webinar series and the topics we'll be covering within them. So as mentioned, today's focus is on policy and privacy and taking a look at the agenda. I will begin by giving an introduction to the AI for Impact initiative and also a quick recap regarding some of the key points around mobile big data analytics for those new to this area. Then I'm delighted to have two experts in the field join us today. The first is my colleague Jade Nester, who is the Director of Consumer Policy at GSMA. Jade will take us through the main policy and privacy considerations when developing new mobile big data analytics services and solutions. This will be followed by a virtual fireside chat, where I'm pleased to have joining us Oyeronke Oyetunde, who is the General Manager for Regulatory Affairs at MTN, before wrapping up today's session with that opportunity for you, the audience, to ask us questions. And then to close, finally on the agenda, we will share with you where you can access additional resources, including many of those that will be referenced in today's session. So moving on, let's begin with a quick introduction to the GSMA's AI for Impact initiative. To set the context, the GSMA launched the AI for Impact initiative in 2017 with the aim to scale up mobile big data analytics and AI solutions sustainably, to address a wide range of humanitarian, social, health, and environmental applications. This is supported with an advisory panel of UN agencies and government and global partners, including, for example, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Bank, but also a task force of 21 mobile operators from around the world. At a global level, we're establishing a common framework for implementing mobile big data projects that involves defining the technical, commercial, and ecosystem needs, as well as the privacy and ethical requirements to deliver sustainable products and services. And then at the local level, we work with operators and partners to implement real-world projects and establish cross-sector collaborations to help unlock the market. So what do we mean when we talk about mobile big data analytics? We're referring to mobile operators being able to provide impactful insights, products, and services by leveraging aggregated, non-identifiable mobile network data, combining this often with third-party data and applying advanced analytics, all whilst protecting and respecting individuals' privacy and carefully considering the ethical implications of their work. By understanding the movements of groups of the population and combining that with other information such as weather, infrastructure maps, public health data, these can provide powerful solutions to support governments. Solutions have been applied to a wide range of scenarios, for example, creating decision support systems to help emergency services respond quickly and effectively to earthquakes and floods, to predicting air pollution levels in cities so that municipalities can take preventative steps, or help health ministries to understand the spread of malaria or dengue fever to enable the efficient planning of healthcare infrastructure. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the GSMA's AI for Impact team is working with its members, government agencies, and partners on sharing knowledge, best practices, and privacy policies to help maximize the contributions at this time. Just quickly wanted to share with you that there are a very wide range of developments and humanitarian challenges that can benefit from the insight derived from big data. In fact, many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals can be informed by the granular population density, population movement information, and associated data that can be extracted from mobile networks. This table shows a framework that simplifies the 17 SDGs, grouping them into 5 main themes, and those themes whereby mobile big data can play a role. These themes also relate to policy areas and can help to focus discussions within governments and the ministries responsible for particular departments and the SDGs, or to focus on the priorities within a country. Under each theme, you'll see there are a number of sub-theme boxes that illustrate specific types of use case for mobile data. Each of these, there are real projects and implementations of mobile big data and for which studies have been publicly published. They each address a genuine problem faced in a country or city. And the range of use cases shown here is clearly quite broad, ranging from long-term infrastructure planning applications, for example, where to site schools or hospitals to best serve the population, to how to plan a transport network, to much shorter applications, for example, how to understand where people are located after a disaster in order to enable more rapid evacuation or to ensure emergency supplies are directed to where they're needed as effectively as possible. Of course, it's not an exhaustive list of the use cases for mobile big data, however, and new applications are already being explored and new models and predictions are being created using the richness of this data. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many operators are also working with national authorities to leverage their big data analytics and AI capabilities to help government understand mobility, the movement of volumes of people, to inform and evaluate interventions and decisions. It really is a global response to this pandemic. In the case of disease outbreaks, mobility is one of the critical factors that contributes to the spread of human transmitted infectious viruses. And so accurate, up-to-date information on aggregate mobility patterns could potentially be vital for monitoring, predicting outbreaks, logistics for medical supplies and staff, or informing where to deploy critical healthcare infrastructure. To give just a couple of examples that we've seen, in Norway since January, even before cases of COVID-19 were detected in the country, Telenor had already started to provide information to the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, using mobility data on people's movement between the country's 356 municipalities. At the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, the COVID-19 task force uses Telenor's mobility dataset to predict plausible spread scenarios of the virus across Norway. Since the Norwegian government actually announced its lockdown measures first on the 12th of March, there have been exceptional changes seen in the level of mobility. And in some places, to give an example, by 65%. In Nigeria, MTN, who we have supporting us today, have worked closely with the government to undertake vulnerability analyses to help plan the healthcare response using the mobility and mobile transaction data to generate insights. And as another example, Vodafone in Italy have provided Lombardy's regional government with heat maps showing how population movements have changed before and after containment. There are many other examples, and you're able to access some of those on the GSMA's Better Future website and the AI for Impact page, where there'll be examples there directing you towards work from Orange, Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, and many others, operators across Europe that are doing similar. The GSMA is working to capture and share these insights and facilitate collaboration and coordination across the public and private sector, and to advocate and educate on some of the best practices. So to wrap up this section on AI for impact and mobile big data analytics, I thought it's useful to share this visual representation with you of the mobile big data analytics ecosystem. This is for when a service is being developed in a single country. You can view this and dig into the detail that sits behind it on the AI for Impact Digital Toolkit, and we'll share more information with you about that later. But at a high level, it represents the process, the stakeholders, and some of the steps required to deliver insights. However, for this webinar, and before I hand over to the next speaker, there are two main elements that I wanted to highlight. First of all, that developing insights is a process. So at a high level, and as shown by the arrows across the top of the graphic you're looking at, this process is one where a clear need is identified, often most successfully done in collaboration between supply side and demand side stakeholders. With this clearly defined need, the mobile operator can use the data and apply their unique knowledge of their networks to create actionable insights to address that identified need. And finally, but equally as important, is the stage of translating those insights to realize the impact, which again requires collaboration and involvement from actors on both the supply and the demand side. Secondly, that understanding and awareness of the regulatory and policy environment, here are represented by the grey area that wraps around all the stakeholders involved, is vital to be able to realize successful, sustainable mobile big data analytics services. So at this point, I would like to introduce my colleague Jade Nester, who's Director of Consumer Policy, to share some of the considerations, principles, and other materials pertaining to the area of policy and privacy when developing mobile big data analytics solutions. Jade, over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can we move to the first slide, please? I thought it would be useful to talk about the policy and privacy considerations at two levels. The first being the steps that need to be considered before or at the outset of a project, and the second being more specific about laws, policy, and best practices. After considering whether a mobile network operator has the ability to develop a mobile big data analytics project, the mobile network operator, MNO, should consider some practical aspects to ensure that the project complies with the law and with internal policies. First, the relevant laws and regulations should be considered, of course. We'll discuss some of these on the next slide, what that can entail. In many cases, the relevant laws will depend on the type of data being processed for the project or shared. Is the data personal or is it non-personal data? Personal data, of course, is any data where there is an identifiable link to an individual. So if you have a name or a phone number, an address, a postal code, that is personal data. But also personal data could be rows of data about an individual without their name or address or telephone number. If you are able to link those other data fields to a specific individual cumulatively, then that can be personal data. So in some cases, you may hear about pseudonymized data, where instead of a name or an identifier, there's a pseudonym that's been generated to protect the identity. That data, in many cases, for example, in the European Union, would be considered personal data and needs to be protected under laws that regulate the use of personal data. However, if you aggregate and anonymize data, for example, if you inject some sort of noise into data and then you aggregate it up to a level of a group, then that data can be considered anonymous. If, based on some sort of reasonable effort, no person could link any of this data and re-identify the person. And this means that most privacy laws would not apply in that context. So that makes the regulatory landscape a little bit easier. But there are still considerations in the context of group privacy and ethics and security that we'll discuss a little bit more on the next slides. There are organizational aspects that should be considered regardless of whether you're talking about personal or non-personal data, such as who needs to sign off on the project. Do you need internal lawyers or other compliance professionals to look at the project? There are also relevant teams that need to be looped into a project. For example, you might have an analytics team that is building the project, but a corporate social responsibility team may have guidelines or policies that need to guide the project as well. So it's important to think about who needs to be looped in. Additionally, you should think about whether there are processes required prior to initiating the project, such as completion of a privacy impact assessment to identify and mitigate privacy risks, or perhaps a human rights impact assessment, depending on whether your organization has something like that. These are all processes that should be considered before the project is initiated. You should also think about whether third parties are needed to complete the project, such as contractors, and should this be factored into legal assessments. For example, if you need a contractor to conduct analytics on your behalf, and that contractor is located in another country, you have to figure out if you can legally transfer that data to the contractor or provide access to that data and make sure that that doesn't violate any sort of data localization obligation In the context of mobile data, this sometimes comes up because there might be a license obligation that says that the data needs to stay in the country. And this could limit your ability to contract with some sort of third party overseas, or even use an analytical team within your own corporate footprint that is located in a different country. In some cases, if you consult with your internal teams appropriately, they might identify government authorities that require a de facto or ad hoc consultation or sign-off. For example, if you want to process anonymized aggregated mobile big data to respond to an epidemic, the law might not specifically require that you consult the health authority before processing data under normal circumstances. For example, if you're a telco, you wouldn't normally ask for sign-off from the health authority to be processing telco data. However, if for the epidemic response, the health authority is working with the telco authority, you might need to consult or get some sort of ad hoc sign-off from that authority based on whatever the government structure is. And coordinating with people on your team who are on the ground and have visibility of that can help prevent issues down the road. Additionally, at a high level, you need to consider how you'll ensure accountability between parties. Even if a government is processing anonymized and aggregated data with no risk of re-identification, it's still important to think through requirements around use limitation to prevent ethical breaches, for example. And finally, you need to think, are there best practices or guidelines to consider? For example, we'll talk about the GSMA COVID-19 privacy guidelines that provide recommendations for mobile network operators being asked to provide data to governments to help with COVID-19. This point is particularly relevant if no privacy law exists in your country, but you want to respect and protect privacy nonetheless. Privacy and ethics, as a matter of fact. Looking at the overall rule of law and human rights record in a specific country can be helpful to assess risks beyond privacy. We can move to the next slide, please. When we talk about accountability, which I mentioned in the slide, more specifically, this is about asking questions like, what data will be made available to whom and in what form? Will the data be pseudonymized before it's aggregated? Who has access to the aggregated data? Will there be any access to raw data? In most cases, for the projects that we work on, only the mobile operator has access to that raw data, and that data has to be locked down even within the mobile network operator, and we do that through access controls. So that's something to think about. Additionally, who has access to the findings? So if you're using aggregated, anonymized data and developing that into insights, then who has access to that data? For how long? Are there researchers who have access to that data? And how long do they have access? These are things to think about. Additionally, we have to think about how you're designing any algorithm that's involved, whether it's fair, what data is involved there, what decisions does it make? And this gets to this last point, who will control actions based on the insights? If, for example, you're processing data for the context of COVID, who decides how that data dictates what policy decisions are made? Is it some sort of group of government authorities that are making that decision? Are you working with an NGO that's doing some sort of intervention? So this needs to be worked out. We could move to the next slide, please. And I see that there's some questions in the Q&A, and I think we'll get to those later. So not ignoring those questions. In terms of the relevant legal frameworks for mobile network operator data, this is important for MNOs, but also for any organization who wants to use aggregated and mobile data. I think it's relevant to know what the requirements are for mobile data. It's a bit different than for other types of data sets. For example, data based on GPS that is gathered from apps may not be subject to any sort of legal requirements if there's no general privacy law in place. Even if there's a general privacy law in place, there could be different laws specifically for telco data. So some of these requirements include license conditions that the mobile network operator is subject to as a condition of getting a license to use spectrum. So to be able to harness that as a natural resource, there are certain requirements imposed by the government. And in some cases, that might include requirements around how data is handled, processed, stored, etc. There might be a specific multimedia or communication law in a country that needs to be considered. E-privacy laws, this includes sectoral legislation, such as the e-privacy directive in Europe that covers the processing of communications data specifically. So in Europe, you have the GDPR, which covers all organizations, but then there's this other law on top of it, which has higher, more stringent requirements just for the use of communications data. There are also interception and disclosure laws for law enforcement purposes that may need to be considered. Sometimes this would impact, for example, if a government wants to use data for some sort of specific public interest purpose, they might try to use some sort of national security law or some sort of government access law to be able to get that data. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Data retention laws basically dictate how long a network operator has to store data, or a limitation on storage, that they should only store it, for example, for 6 months. There are also electronic transaction laws. This could be relevant if you're using transactions information to, for example, hypothetically monitor economic bounce back after COVID. You could take aggregated transaction information to see how often people are engaging in electronic transactions, but you need to figure out what those laws are first. And there also might be statutory codes of conduct or guidelines to consider that the industry has adopted. Can we move to the next slide, please? We've talked a little bit about some of the laws that are in place in various countries. The GSMA has done a lot of work around defining what a good privacy framework looks like that protects consumers while also enabling innovation. And this is about creating a harmonized framework where similar types of data across the mobile ecosystem, for example, are treated the same way, just to provide regulatory certainty, but also certainty for consumers about how their data is being used. And we call this a smart data privacy laws. We have a report that is based on this law. But I think this is the sort of framework that enables mobile data analysis for a number of reasons. The first is that there's this emphasis on accountability. We talked about accountability with trying to figure out who's doing what in a project and how to think about access controls, for example. That's part of accountability. It requires that organizations should be liable for what they do with personal data, and it's about organizations being able to demonstrate both to individuals and to supervisory authorities that they've put in place comprehensive and effective measures to protect privacy. This includes policies, processes, and practices. One of the other aspects of the smart privacy framework is that it's horizontal, which applies in this case when we're talking about mobile big data analytics in particular. A general data privacy law, such as the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, usually apply to any processing of personal data, regardless of the sector or the technology. This is positive for consumers because it gives them consistent protection that's technology neutral and future-proof. This is helpful because in a situation where you have numerous different sectoral requirements with different levels of stringency or lack of stringency, that might create a confusing environment to actually conduct a mobile big data analytics project, or it leads to misunderstandings. For example, people want to harness mobile data the same way that they would harness GPS data and think it's as easy, but it's actually not because of different regulations in many cases. But if you have a horizontal framework, then at least data is processed the same way across different platforms. A smart privacy law should also be principles focused, so it should be more about ensuring that principles are recognized in the framework, and we'll get to some principles in some of the following slides, so I won't talk too much about that right now. Overall, a smart privacy framework should also be focused on mitigating the risk of harm to individuals. So it's imperative to, at the outset, think about how individuals could be harmed by data processing. And privacy by design, which is another process mentioned here, helps mitigate that risk. Privacy by design requires organizations to identify and mitigate risks throughout the life cycle of a product or service. Also, data protection impact assessments are tied to this, and it's a mechanism used by organizations to evaluate the impact on individuals of certain high-risk processing activities. It's good to have a data protection impact assessment mandated by law because that helps embed a culture of privacy across organizations and across the country. And another aspect here, which I mentioned earlier, is that a smart privacy law should enable data flows where data can be accessed or stored abroad, subject to protections, of course, and safeguards, but there isn't an absolute prohibition on data transfers because it has negative consequences for companies, but also on consumers because they can't leverage the best services in other countries. So it leads to downward stream negative effects. If we could move to the next slide, please. So at the GSMA, as Rob mentioned, we have our AI for Impact project. And from the outset, we've been considering privacy and ethical issues. That's one reason that all of the insights that are analyzed for this project by NGOs and by governments are all based on aggregated and anonymized data. So no identifiable data is ever transferred outside of a mobile network operator in this project. There may be some circumstances where a mobile network operator contracts with a party to conduct analytics subject to very tight contractual controls, but again, that would still be considered processing by the MNO in that case, subject to all the rules and regulations that would apply to the mobile network operator. So these are the sorts of data exchanges that we're doing in AI for Impact. We have a code of conduct that operators conducting trials under the program have to adhere to, which has certain requirements. So we're looking beyond just complying with the law here and adding other requirements on top. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because the basis for our code of conduct is our GSMA mobile privacy principles, but then we've also added some additional requirements, including some ethical considerations as well. Could we please move to the next slide? So the GSMA mobile privacy principles are basically the fundamental components of a good privacy framework. This ties back to our smart privacy laws. These were just recommendations that we developed for the mobile industry to advance robust privacy protection across the mobile landscape. In some cases, these principles might just apply to, or might initially apply to a context where data is collected by a mobile network operator. For example, if a mobile network operator is processing data to provide service, then this third principle, user choice and control, would apply to the use of that data. However, if the data is aggregated and anonymized, like we do for the AI for Impact project, and that data cannot be linked to an individual, then consumer-facing obligations would not be relevant for consideration in the project. Generally, in the world of data protection, if you have to process more data to be able to provide someone with a particular privacy right, then that violates the idea of privacy. So if you are a mobile operator and you've anonymized and aggregated data for COVID, and someone comes to you and says, I want to know if my data was involved in that set of anonymized data, it would actually violate the idea of privacy for them to try to go back and re-identify that user from the data set. I hope that makes sense, but if people have questions, they can ask afterwards. Also, this mentions security, and just to point out that there are multiple reasons why you would want to still continue to protect privacy even with aggregated and anonymized data. Of course, there could be impacts on groups if you're using anonymized and aggregated data, like isolation of a particular group in a geographic area. But there could also be trade secrets, for example, that could be revealed in a data set. So security is always a good idea, regardless of whether you're dealing with personal data or non-personal data. You can move to the next slide, please. So in addition to the mobile privacy principles and to the AI for Impact Code of Conduct that we developed, we also developed privacy guidelines for COVID-19 response. We recognize, of course, that accurate, up-to-date information on aggregated mobility patterns can be potentially vital for monitoring, predicting outbreaks, and planning future resource needs for COVID, such as testing beds, medical staff, equipment. Rob talked about some of these use cases earlier. Other use cases could include identifying people who have been in contact with confirmed cases, or informing people they've entered into a containment area, for example. Those are slightly different. Those are more identifiable, and there's certain legal requirements that would apply to that. Again, we've been focusing at the GSMA on the aggregated and anonymized use cases. We're simply mentioning these other use cases because those are hypothetical uses of the data depending on the legal framework at play. The mobile industry recognizes the urgency with which governments must act to slow the spread of COVID-19, and we understand that they're seeking help with some of these efforts, including for mobile network operators. But we recognize that the use of this data by governments or aid agencies, for example, can raise serious privacy concerns. And these guidelines reflect recommendations on how the mobile industry can maintain trust while responding to those government and public health agencies that have sought assistance in the fight against COVID-19. The overarching principle here, and you'll see this in red, is that to preserve trust, which is critical, the use of mobile big data for COVID-19 must be lawful, transparent, and time-bound. By lawful, we mean that the laws around personal and non-personal data must apply, but there also are considerations, again, in this context of identifiable data. So if a government or agency is requesting information about specific individuals, for example, to identify people who have been in contact with confirmed cases, that data should be shared based only on a valid legal ground for processing, such as, depending on the local law, obtaining the valid consent of the individual, acting in the individual's vital interests in an emergency, or pursuant to specific laws requiring the sharing of the data. So some countries have passed specific pandemic regulation that allows them to access identifiable data about individuals specifically in the context of a pandemic, and that's to help, for example, with contact tracing. So it depends on the specific legal framework. We maintain that any law that asks for mobile network operator data for government purposes must be necessary and proportionate to achieve a specified and legitimate aim that's consistent with internationally recognized privacy standards, human rights, and other relevant laws. I recommend that you take a look at the guidelines themselves. We can share that, I think, in the Q&A or afterwards. But we have a number of assurances that are listed here that are in blue on the slide that mobile network operators should seek from governments. So we've talked a lot about accountability requirements for organizations and for MNOs specifically, but there are also assurances that governments need to give mobile network operators. For example, that they will respect a prohibition on any attempt to re-identify the data, and that they will only use data for purposes that have been specified at the outset of the project, and that they'll avoid discrimination and respect fundamental rights. So no use of the data should be targeting any specific group to discriminate against them. These are very important things for us. If we can move to the next slide. So just to wrap this up, in the specific context of artificial intelligence, we also issued some privacy and ethics principles specifically guiding AI in social good type projects. So projects designed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And this goes into a little bit more detail about some of the ethical aspects here. So there is an express do no harm principle requirement for inclusivity. The use of AI shouldn't discriminate against certain parties, and it should be inclusive. Fairness, I think we've been hearing a lot about that in the context of artificial intelligence. And again, transparency, accountability, security, and safety, that gets reinforced here. But sustainability and societal well-being at the high level are also mentioned as one of the goals. So I think for now, we can wrap this up, and then we can answer questions later. And we're also going to be having a fireside chat with Oyeronke Oyetunde, who we're very happy is gracing us with her presence on this webinar.
Thank you very much, Jade.
Great, thank you for joining us. So we wanted to talk to you about your practical experience. You, I know, have been working in the policy landscape for a long time, and you've also been privy to a number of these projects in the social good context. So we wanted to ask you, based on your experience, and based on the fact that mobile network operator data is an increasingly valuable resource for governments and NGOs, what are some of the questions and considerations before initiating a project with these potential partners?
Thank you. The first question we usually consider is the first issue we actually look at is what is the applicable legal and regulatory framework within which that request is being made. What are the requisite license conditions applicable? And the key thing for us, and from the start, the key thing and the starting point is preserving the confidentiality of customer data. And very often our license provisions actually make specific provision for this, and it makes it an obligation for operators to observe. As a result of this, we will need to therefore establish whether there are lawful purposes for which such data can be actually released and to whom such data might be released. In quite a lot of operations which we have in Africa, such legitimate purposes might be for the purposes of assisting law enforcement agencies with the investigation of crime, or to enhance the provision of services by operators, or to enhance the provision of regulatory services by, say, for example, our regulators, say, for example, where they're looking for quality of service data and things like that. The second the second issue for us is ensuring the requisite regulatory certainty and legal justification within the framework. This is particularly so where there are gaps. It may be the regulatory framework, or say, for example, like as occurred during the pandemic, where there isn't any actual clarity as to what to do in situations of emergency. And in this respect, I would like to refer to the South African Information and Communications COVID-19 National Disasters Regulation, which is a good example of how regulation stepped in to address the gap. And what it required was it prescribed minimum standards to be complied with by operators, and what exactly the scope of operation, the scope of what operators could do within the regulations. So it addressed things like requiring that operators disseminate information on behalf of government, a minimum of 2 announcements per day. It also required that we support the national response to the pandemic where necessary, and it also required that we support any mitigation measures as required by government. Obviously, the scope of where this was required would be specified in whatever directives were given, and operators were bound to observe the continuity of services. I think it was a very good law, and it stepped in the emergency to fill a gap. And that's the kind of certainty that we operators look for in circumstances such as this.
That's really helpful. And I think that perspective is really valuable for all of us. Have you noticed, given the successful adoption of some of these projects and the adjustments at the legal and regulatory level, has there been an enhanced focus on data sharing and data analytics across Africa, where you work, where MTN is predominantly located? Do you think that there's an emerging interest in enhancing data sharing there?
Okay, from an operator perspective, the way we see it, it's very key to ensure that whatever data sharing takes place, particularly where there's a public interest need or requirement, it's best that it be led by government. Therefore, for us, it is best that the prior buy-in of government is obtained. Then a second issue for us is ensuring that there's clarity with regard to the actual data usage. You know, what you said was the need, the necessity. Is it necessary? How much data is required? These are the things, the limits of the data usage. How long is it going to be needed for? You know, and what is the exact role of the operator? That, in my own opinion, is very, very key. Also, ensuring that there is the requisite transparency. For us, that is very key. The public and or consumers must actually have the requisite information. There must be the requisite transparency with regards to what that data is going to be used. And there's therefore a need for engagement, a need for proper communication in this respect. People need to know what's going on. Apart from that, from the African perspective, what tends to happen is where any sensitive data is required, you know, it's usually required across the board, you know, within a country, maybe of all operators and so on. And what tends to happen is we now engage further to determine, as I've explained before, the scope and the parameters of such data. I think that for us is very key in terms of enhancing data sharing and analytics. In a short word, it is just good to make sure that there's the requisite regulatory certainty.
And would you say that's probably one of the biggest risks, is that there could be some sort of inadvertent violation of a law And also on the flip side of that, is there an opportunity for regulators to consider changing the law to make mobile data analytics more viable?
I think so. I think there is a need for a public discourse on the issue. There's a need for all the stakeholders, those who actually need the data, maybe from the public sector, from the NGOs, amongst NGOs, even operators. There is a need to ensure that in every environment there are privacy laws, there are privacy regulations that actually meet the requirements of the society concerned. I think that is very key for us as operators. Otherwise, we find that maybe operators tend to be the ones who are required to provide such data at a huge risk. But that risk is minimized where there is clarity as to how it is to be done.
That's great. Thank you, Ronke. And thank you so much for joining us again.
So yes, once again, the AI for Impact Toolkit, a resource that's available to you. It covers the areas that we've addressed in today's session, but also looks at a number of the other themes and requirements and recommendations built on from the GSMA's AI for Impact team's experience since the project's been running in 2017 in how to develop and scale solutions that are using mobile big data analytics. The last thing, therefore, for me to do is to say thank you to both Jade and Oyeronke for joining us today and for sharing their insights. If you are interested, the GSMA will, over the coming months, be continuing with a series of blogs and webinars on this theme. Today, obviously, the policy and privacy side. The next, which will follow late in August, likely the week commencing the 24th, I believe it is the one focused on the technical delivery and adoption. And then the subsequent session will be focusing on funding and sustainability. So within those, we'll continue to bring and share with you contributions from mobile operator experts and hopefully give you the opportunity to develop a deeper level of understanding for both operators and governments wishing to develop impactful mobile data analytics capabilities. The email address for you to be able to register your interest is on the screen. That's all from us today. Thank you so much for attending us. We hope you found this beneficial, insightful, and we hope you're able to join us on the next iteration. Thanks, everyone.